They said the well was dead. Just a circle of dust-choked stones, a hollow throat that hadn't tasted a drop of water in 20 years. Thomas didn't buy it. Not for a second. He had $17 to his name. He had a ranch nobody else on God's green earth wanted. And he had this well. He tied a frayed rope to the old, creaking windlass. He lowered a battered tin bucket into a darkness that smelled of stone and old secrets. 30 feet down, metal-kissed rock. A scrape. A spark. Then silence. Thomas braced himself. He hauled, hand over blistered hand, his shoulders screaming with the effort. When the bucket finally broke the circle of light at the top, it wasn't empty. Cold, clear water sloshed against the tin sides. He set it down on the cracked earth, his breath fogging in the brutal heat. And then he saw it, something glinting just beneath the surface, like a sly wink from the deep dark. His fingers plunged into the icy water. It wasn't a nail, it wasn't a washer. It was a coin, gold or something pretending to be. It lay heavy and solid on his palm. It was warmer than the water, warmer than the air. It was etched with strange marks, letters from a language he'd never seen. The weight was all wrong for gold, too. It was dense, heavy, as if the metal itself remembered being part of a mountain. He turned it over. It caught the sun, and for a split second he swore the engraving shifted, the lines twisting into new shapes the moment he wasn't looking directly at them. People don't just abandon land for no reason. Sterling Boone, the man who owned this place before, he hadn't. One day, Boone was out here, mending a fence, bragging to anyone who'd listen about a fortune he was about to find. The next morning, his coffee was cold on the kitchen table. His boots were still sitting right by the bed. He was just gone. No note, no goodbye, only a well everyone swore up and down was bone dry. Thomas slipped the strange coin into his shirt pocket. It settled against his chest like a second heartbeat. Steady, and far too warm. If there was one coin, there could be more. And if there were more, they might just explain why this place quit on men who refused to quit on it. He needed answers. His whole life had become a question mark. He gripped the rope again, his knuckles white. "All right," he muttered to the darkness below. "Show me." 3 months earlier, Thomas had watched his entire world burn down. Debt collectors had taken the farm his father had built from nothing, the same fields Thomas had poured his own sweat and blood into since he was a boy. His wife, tired of scraping by on empty promises that never ripened into bread, packed up their children and left for the city back east. He was left all alone, with calloused hands, a broken reputation, and a crushing silence where his family's laughter used to be. So when the county clerk shoved a yellowed deed across the worn desk and muttered, "It's free land. No one else will touch it," Thomas didn't even hesitate. A deserted ranch, a well marked dry, soil the locals swore was cursed. None of it mattered. To him, this wasn't some burden. It was the last rung on the ladder before the long drop into nothing. He signed his name. He knew the whispers followed him out the door. Whispers about the place, about men who vanished, suppers left half-eaten, horses found untied but never ridden again. Still, for Thomas, it was the only chance he had left, the only chance to claw back a piece of his dignity, to prove to the world and to himself that he wasn't the failure everyone had decided he was. The land no one wanted had become his last desperate hope. Thomas had just pulled the second bucket up from the well, the strange coin still pressing, hot and insistent, against his palm when the crunch of hooves on dry earth made him spin around. A woman rode into view. Her posture was straight and steady. Her eyes were as sharp as flint. She swung down from her horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more of her life in a saddle than out of it. "Clara Maddox," she said, her voice clear and direct. She brushed the dust from her gloves. I run the spread just east of here. Been watching you since you first set foot on this place." Thomas kept one hand near his pocket, feeling the coin's impossible weight burning right through his shirt. He gave her a cautious nod. "Just trying to get some water flowing," he said. "A man's got to drink." Clara's gaze slid past him, fixing on the well. Her expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. "That hole's been nothing but trouble since the day it was dug," she said. "Sterling Boone learned that the hard way." The name hit Thomas like a hammer. He remembered the whispers in town. Boone, the man who'd bragged about riches, then vanished into thin air. "What happened to him?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Nobody knows for certain. One night he was right here, talking about this well like it held all the secrets of the universe. The next morning, he was gone. Clothes still hanging in the house, supper left half-finished on the table, his horse still standing patiently in the corral. A cold wind pressed against the back of Thomas's neck, though the air was still. This wasn't just some town rumor. This was a warning. Clara Maddox hadn't ridden all this way for a neighborly introduction. She'd come to tell him that men who got too curious about this land, about this well, never seemed to last very long. And the way her eyes lingered on the well's dark mouth made Thomas wonder if, by drawing up that very first coin, he had already stepped directly into Sterling Boone's long, cold shadow. Clara's voice dropped even lower, almost swallowed by the sigh of the wind across the barren ranch. She stood near the well's rim, her boots clicking softly against the weathered stones. "There's something down there, Thomas," she said, her gaze fixed on the black circle, as if it were staring right back at her. "Not just water. Something that moves." Thomas frowned, but his hands stilled on the rope. He had heard it, too. A faint stirring from the depths. It wasn't the soft lapping of liquid. It was a deeper sound. A scrape, like stone shifting against stone far below. It was enough to raise the fine hairs on the back of his neck. She turned to him, her eyes shadowed with a grim memory. "You know why folks really don't come near this land? Sterling Boone. For the last 6 weeks before he vanished, the man wasn't himself anymore. He couldn't sleep. He stopped riding into town. He stopped answering when neighbors called out to him." She paused, letting the words sink in. "When we did catch a glimpse of him, he looked hollowed out, as though the nights had drained the very marrow right out of his bones." Thomas tried to shrug it off as simple madness, but the coin in his pocket pulsed with that odd living warmth, as though it was agreeing with her every single word. Clara took a steadying breath, her expression grim. "My best ranch hand, a good man named Jebediah, came over to help Sterling with some fence repairs. He found him right here, sitting by this well. And he was talking, not mumbling to himself, talking, like someone was answering him back from the dark." The story clawed at Thomas's nerves. "Jeb swore he heard Sterling laugh," she continued. "Then he'd pause, listening. Then he'd whisper, like he was being told the greatest secrets in the world." He tightened his grip on the rope, his jaw set. Wells didn't talk. They didn't whisper secrets, but the raw, honest fear in Clara's eyes told him she'd seen enough to believe it. To prove her point, she nodded toward the bucket of water he'd set aside. Just a few minutes earlier, it had been brimming with crystal-clear water. Now, as the light shifted, the liquid looked murkier. It was tinged with a faint darkness that hadn't been there before. It was as if the well had drawn a long, slow breath and changed its mind about what it would offer. Thomas stared down at the shifting surface, his stomach knotting. Water should in turn from clear to dark in the span of a few moments. It felt less like a source of life and more like a dire warning. Clara's words lingered in the heavy air. "This well doesn't give without taking something back, Thomas. Sterling found that out far too late. He swallowed hard, the coin's unnatural heat pressing against his chest like a brand. For the first time since setting foot on this abandoned ranch, he wondered if what he'd found wasn't a fortune at all. He wondered if it was bait. Clara's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to play her final card. From an inside pocket of her riding jacket, she drew out a small bundle wrapped in worn, stained cloth. With slow, deliberate care, she unfolded the fabric. Inside lay a coin, golden, heavy, and marked with the same strange, shifting etchings as the one Thomas had just pulled from the well. The sunlight caught its surface, throwing off the same unnatural gleam that had unsettled him from the very start. "I found this in my chicken coop," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. 3 days after Sterling Boone vanished, it was buried 6 inches down in the dirt floor. The hens refused to go near that corner of the coop after that. I had to move them all. Thomas reached into his own pocket, his fingers curling around the warm coin that seemed to throb faintly against his chest. He held it up beside hers. They were identical, the same impossible weight, the same shifting symbols that looked different depending on how the light struck them. It was like staring at a reflection that refused to stay still. "There are more," Thomas said, the certainty hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He nodded toward the well's black mouth, as though the darkness itself had ears. "I can feel them down there." Clara quickly rewrapped her coin, tucking it back deep into her coat, as if it were something poisonous. Her boots scraped against the dirt as she stepped back from the well, shaking her head slowly. "That's exactly what Sterling said," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Word for word, the day before he disappeared." Her retreating figure left Thomas standing alone at the rim of the well, the coin burning hotter than ever in his palm. What he had mistaken for an opportunity now felt like a snare, its jaws slowly tightening around him, and he was the only thing caught inside. Clara's final warning landed like a stone in Thomas's chest. "Sterling Boone," she'd said, her voice barely a whisper. "He wasn't the first man this ranch has swallowed whole. 15 years earlier, a man named Samuel Delaney had vanished in the exact same way. Healthy, steady, a family man. Then, suddenly, he was whispering about a treasure in the well, and then he just snuffed out of his own life, like a candle flame pinched between 2 fingers. Delaney left behind a wife and 2 bewildered children. The only thread the neighbors could follow ran straight back to the stone ring in the center of the yard. It seemed men drew near that dark mouth, and then they just drifted away. Away from their chores, their beds, their very names. Thomas had seen loneliness ruin good men before, but this felt like something else entirely, something colder. Before Delaney, nobody lasted here. For 20 long years, the parcel of land lay empty, fenced in by wind, rumor, and a heavy hush that worked better than any barbed wire. In town, voices always dropped a key when the property came up in conversation, as if just saying the syllables out loud might wake up whatever was listening out here. Some said the ground was sour. Others swore the well pulled at you, the way a coming storm hums in your teeth. Thomas wanted to spit on the ground and call it all superstition, but the coin in his pocket ran as warm as a live coal, seeming to beat in time with his own pulse until his breath hitched in his chest. Stories were just smoke, yes, but smoke always names a fire. Clara had then swept the horizon with a rancher's practiced eye. "You see that?" The evening light made everything cruelly sharp, and there, stitched into the dusty yard, were fresh hoof prints. They were tight, disciplined ovals, circling the well once, twice, 3 clean loops. Then they angled off toward the low, rolling hills to the east. No rider had passed them, no silhouette had appeared on the rise. The tracks had simply arrived while they were standing there talking. The edges were still crisp, the gravel still tipped from a recent weight. It felt like they were left by a ghost, not a horse. The silence around them changed its shape. This wasn't the gentle quiet of a day cooling down. It was a quiet that was actively listening back. The rope hanging over the well's stone rim creaked, though the air lay perfectly still, and from far below a faint echo rose up. Not a splash, not the scrape of stone. It was something else, like metal sighing under the heat of a blacksmith's bellows. "Those weren't there a minute ago," Thomas said, his voice tight. Clara's jaw was set like iron. Sterling's last weeks were full of signs just like these, tracks without riders, doors he swore he'd latched found swinging open in the morning. Thomas took a step back from the rim. The well no longer looked like a promise. It looked like a snare baited with gold, patient, practiced, and wide awake. The twilight deepened as Thomas stared into the dark mouth of the well. Clara had ridden away, her last words hanging in the air like a verdict. "Leave while you still can." But walking away had never been in his nature, not when his life was on the line. He looped the rope tight around the stone rim, tugged it twice to test its strength, and swung his legs over the edge. The descent was rough. His boots scraped against jagged rock as the circle of sky above shrank to the size of a pale coin. The air grew damp and cool, wrapping around him like a cellar shroud. Yet when his boots finally hit the bottom, there was no water waiting for him. There was only loose soil, debris, and a silence so thick he could feel it pressing against his eardrums. He struck a match. He lifted the small, sputtering flame, and he saw evidence no rumor could ever invent. The walls of the well bore deliberate scars. These were marks left by tools, not by time. Someone had chipped in pride at the stone, over and over, as if they were searching for something hidden within the rock itself. At his feet lay dozens of coins, scattered like dark offerings. They weren't random. They formed a rough, deliberate circle, enclosing a patch of earth that was darker and looser than the rest. The coin in his pocket grew hot again, pulsing with a strange rhythm that seemed to match the frantic beating of his own heart. Kneeling, Thomas clawed at the soil. His fingers struck wood. It was smooth and weathered, but undeniably shaped by human hands. He unearthed a small box, no larger than a Bible, but it was far, far heavier than it should have been. He grunted as he hauled it free, startled by its impossible weight. The flickering matchlight danced across iron hinges, slick with age and damp. Around him, more coins winked from the dirt. 30, maybe 40 of them in all. Their strange markings glinted like watchful, unblinking eyes in the dark. Thomas stuffed handfuls of them into his pockets until the seams of his pants strained. Then he hugged the heavy wooden box against his chest. The match burned down to his fingers, and he quickly lit another, his throat tight with a mixture of awe and a deep, growing unease. Whatever he had just uncovered wasn't just treasure. It was bait. Bait left in a trap that had already swallowed men whole. And yet he knew he couldn't turn back now. He was in too deep. The second match sputtered in Thomas's hand, throwing a thin, nervous glow against the damp stone walls. That's when he saw it. Letters, carved deep into the rock. The strokes were rough, urgent, each one born of pure desperation. "They're watching. They know what I found. If something happens to me, look for the real treasure in the old church foundation." The initials scratched below it were unmistakable: S.B. Sterling Boone. The vanished rancher had left one last warning, scribbled from the very edge of his own doom. Thomas's stomach knotted. This wasn't just about coins anymore. This was about men, or something worse, who were watching, waiting, and striking down anyone who got too close. He lit another match, his fingers fumbling as he pried the heavy wooden box open. Inside, wrapped in oil-stained cloth, was a brittle letter. It was penned with a trembling hand. "To whoever finds this, my name is Sterling Boone. And if you're reading this, I'm probably dead." Thomas swallowed hard, the match flame guttering as his eyes raced over the desperate words. The letter explained what the markings on the wall had only hinted at. The gold coins weren't treasure at all. They were bait, scattered deliberately to lure men with empty pockets and desperate dreams to this cursed ranch. One by one, Boone wrote, they had come chasing a fortune, and one by one, they had vanished. Someone's been using this place for years, maybe decades. They've been watching me, waiting for the right moment. I figured it all out too late. The match hissed low, but Thomas struck another, desperate to read every last line. The real treasure isn't the gold. It's information, secrets so powerful that men would kill to keep them buried. The words seemed to burn hotter than the flame itself. The letter pointed north, half a mile toward the crumbling ruins of an old church foundation. Beneath a stone marked with an X, Boone promised, lay the truth. The real reason men had died, and the real reason this land had been abandoned for so long. The warning closed with a final, terrifying chill. Be careful. They know when someone finds the coins. They're probably already watching you. As the last flame died, Thomas pressed the letter tight to his chest. The heat of the coins burned through his pockets like scattered embers. Above him, the small circle of sky was now completely swallowed by the deepening night. He wasn't alone down here. Not anymore. Thomas folded Sterling Boone's letter with shaking hands and shoved it deep inside his jacket. But before he could even start to climb out of the well, a sharp crack split the night air. A branch broken by something heavy. Then another sound, measured footsteps. Not one person, but several, pressing softly against the dry earth. He froze, his heart thundering against his ribs. They were here. Whoever Boone had warned him about, they were closing in. Quickly he doused his oil lamp, plunging the entire ranch into a suffocating darkness, broken only by the cold, distant glint of the stars overhead. The coins in his pocket seemed to burn even hotter now, like they wanted to betray him with their insistent glow. He slipped across the yard, crouching low, careful to keep his boots from crunching too loudly on the loose gravel. The sounds of movement multiplied. 3, maybe 4 men, advancing in a loose, practiced circle. They weren't aimless wanderers. Their steps were precise, purposeful, like hunters trained to corner their prey. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as one shadow passed close enough for him to smell the stale tobacco on the man's coat. He held his breath until the shadow moved past, then darted silently toward the only refuge still standing on the property. The old, abandoned ranch house. The door creaked like a scream as he pushed it open. The stale air inside rolled out, thick with dust and the ghosts of forgotten lives. Everything remained just as Clara had said, untouched, as if Sterling Boone had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. A shirt still hung from a peg by the door, its sleeves sagging as though waiting for arms that would never fill them again. Boots stood neatly beside the bed. A coffee cup sat on the table, the dregs long since dried in the bottom, a perfect snapshot of a life paused mid-motion. A home frozen in time at the very moment disaster struck. The sight made Thomas's skin crawl. This was exactly how they wanted him to end up. Another ghost in a house full of them. Through a cracked window pane, he glimpsed movement outside. 2 shadows drifting between the outbuildings, another holding a lantern low, its yellow glow bobbing deliberately through the darkness. They were circling the house now, certain he'd run here for cover. His fingers brushed against the edge of Boone's letter, hidden deep in his jacket. North. The church ruins. That was his only chance. Moving cautiously, Thomas slid through the darkened house towards the back door. Beyond that wall waited his mare, Patience, tethered near the corral. If he could just untie her quietly and ride hard into the hills, He might just stay ahead of the men who were hunting him. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a shout. Every second he wasted tightened the noose around his neck. He knew the risk, but there was no other choice. Tonight, this ranch was no refuge. It was a trap, and his only hope lay in reaching the deep shadows of the northern horizon before they caught him. The back door gave way with a low sigh, but Thomas didn't make it 3 steps out into the night before a voice stopped him cold. "That's far enough, friend." Out of the shadows emerged 3 men, their rifles gleaming in the dim starlight. The leader walked at the center, a tall, lean figure in a long black coat, his confidence radiating from him like a poison. His eyes held the steady, unnerving calm of a man who had stared down fear so many times it no longer registered. He carried no lantern, yet his companions flanked him, their rifles held at the ready. One was a broad, thick-necked man. The other had a nasty scar that cut across his cheek, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. "Name's Fletcher Knox," the tall one said, his voice smooth as oil. "I represent certain business interests in this territory, interests that care very much about what goes on at this particular ranch." Thomas forced his shoulders to stay square, though every instinct screamed at him to turn and run. "I just stopped for water, shelter, that's all." Fletcher chuckled. The sound was dry and completely humorless. "Oh, I think we both know you found more than just water. We've been keeping an eye on this place ever since Sterling Boone went and disappeared. Knew it was only a matter of time before someone got curious enough to lower a bucket." The scarred man's rifle twitched upward. "Check his pockets, Fletcher." Thomas stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the inside of his jacket, where Sterling's letter lay hidden. He couldn't let them find it. Not yet. Fletcher's gaze sharpened, noticing the slight movement, but instead of pressing the issue, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Territorial law can be a complicated thing," he said, offering the sheet as though it were a favor. "But it can also be simplified, with the right signature." He let the paper unfold. "You see, when a man takes up an abandoned property, after 30 days, it's considered his by right of settlement. Problem is, you've only been here 3 days. But lucky for you, we already took the liberty of drawing up a sworn statement saying you've been here over a month. All it needs is your name." The implication landed with a heavy thud. They had prepared for this exact scenario. They weren't improvising. For them, this was just routine. "And once you sign that," Fletcher continued, producing a second document, "you sign another transfer. Nice and neat. The property passes directly to my employers, without any messy questions from the territorial office. Everyone's happy. And more importantly, everyone stays alive." Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of the coins in his pockets pressed against his legs like lead anchors. "And if I don't sign?" The man with the scar grinned, a wolfish, predatory expression. "Then you disappear, just like Boone, just like Delaney before him." Fletcher's smile didn't waver, though his words cut like shards of glass. They were men who thought they could hold on to what they found here, men who started asking the wrong questions. They vanished without a trace, their boots still by the bed, their supper still on the table. This ranch has a way of swallowing folks whole when they get greedy. Don't you make the same mistake. The third man, the broad one, stepped forward, his gravelly voice filled with impatience. "We should just deal with him now, Fletcher. Save ourselves the trouble." "Patience, Caleb," Fletcher murmured, though his cold eyes never left Thomas's face. "Our friend here may yet prove useful. He's clever enough to see what he's stumbled into, and clever men can sometimes live longer if they choose to cooperate." Thomas forced himself to breathe evenly, his mind racing back to Sterling's letter, to the desperate warning etched in the well stone. "They're watching. Look for the real treasure in the old church foundation. That was his one advantage, his one secret. Fletcher and his men, they didn't seem to know about the church. They wanted the coins, maybe the land itself, but they were blind to the deeper secret. So he played dumb. What kind of questions did they ask? Fletcher exchanged a quick glance with his men, measuring just how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "Questions about where the coins came from, who put them there, why they're still turning up after all these years. None of your concern. You just need to sign these papers and forget you ever saw a single thing." "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked again, his tone a little steadier now. The scarred man's rifle rose an inch higher. Caleb sneered. Fletcher let the silence stretch out before answering. "Then, like I said, you disappear. No trail, no explanation. The desert is very good at keeping secrets. You can ask Sterling Boone. You can ask Samuel Delaney. Oh, wait. You can't." Thomas felt his pulse hammering in his ears, but he forced a shrug. "Maybe I'm not as easy to scare as they were." Fletcher's smile hardened into something made of steel. "Everyone's easy to scare when they finally realize they're standing in their own graveyard." The words lingered, as heavy as the desert night. The air around them seemed to shrink, pressing in with the weight of unseen watchers. The coins in Thomas's pocket burned hotter, as though urging him to speak, to give them up. But he stayed silent. Revealing the truth about the church foundation right now would be signing his own death warrant. That single piece of knowledge was the only blade he held against these men. Fletcher leaned closer, his voice low and intimate, almost a whisper. "Think very carefully, Mr. Brooks. You have a family somewhere, don't you? Debts to pay, hopes for a future. None of that matters if you end up in the same unmarked hole as Boone. But you sign these papers and you walk away with your life. Maybe even a little money in your pocket, enough to buy yourself a new start, somewhere far away from here." Thomas met his gaze, unflinching. "Funny. That's the same promise you gave the last two men, isn't it?" For the first time, Fletcher's calm cracked. His jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The scarred man shifted his weight, ready to strike. Caleb's hand hovered near his pistol, but Thomas knew he had planted a seed of doubt, of suspicion. And while they stood there, measuring just how much he truly knew, he would guard Sterling Boone's secret with his life. Because, unlike them, he finally understood. The coins weren't the treasure. They were just the bait. And he wasn't about to bite. Not yet. Thomas sat across the dusty table from Fletcher Knox, listening, measuring every pause, every twitch of the man's hard mouth. The three men with him weren't common drifters. They were disciplined, dangerous. They were comfortable pointing rifles at a man's head like it was nothing more than a casual handshake. Fletcher's voice had been smooth, oily, as he described the so-called simplification of property law. How Thomas could just sign his life and the land away. But then the conversation shifted. It turned darker. The coins, those strange heavy tokens that still burned against Thomas's skin, were not what they seemed. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his hands spread wide as though he were confessing a simple truth he'd told 100 times before. "See, you think those coins are treasure, don't you?" he said with a smirk. "They're not. They're wages, payments." He let that hang in the air for a moment. Every single piece of gold slipped down that well was earned by moving certain goods across the border without the blessing of the customs office, rifles, liquor, opium, whatever fetched the highest price. That well wasn't just for water, Brooks. It was a safe drop, a place for payment. Men got paid with that gold, and men got silenced with it too. The scarred man, Reuben, spat on the floor. "Boone figured it out. Delaney before him, too. And you know what happened? They started asking questions. Questions just like you. and now they're just bones somewhere the coyotes won't even tell. Thomas's fists tightened in his lap. Smuggling. It explained the vanishing owners, the strange weight of the coins, the desperate secrecy. Sterling Boone hadn't been crazy. He'd been hunted. And now Thomas sat in the very same chair, under the barrels of the very same rifles. Trying to hold his ground, to find some leverage, Thomas muttered the words before he could stop himself. The Church Foundation. The words slipped out, barely a whisper, but they crashed through the room like a thunderclap. Silence. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto him at once. Fletcher's oily smile vanished completely. "What did you just say?" Thomas cursed himself inwardly. Sterling's message had been so clear. If I don't make it, the real treasure is in the old church foundation. It had been the only glimmer of hope he carried. The one thing he thought these men didn't know, and he had just said it out loud. Reuben's rifle clamped tighter against his shoulder. Caleb's gravelly voice was sharp with alarm. "He knows about the other drop site, Fletcher." Fletcher's face hardened, his eyes glittering like chips of flint. "Where did you hear that name? Who told you?" Thomas forced a shrug, trying to backtrack. "Heard it in town. Folks gossip." Reuben snarled. "Liar. Nobody in town knows about that place except us." Fletcher raised a hand for silence, though his other hand hovered near the butt of the pistol at his hip. His voice was lower now, colder. "That little slip of the tongue tells me you've seen more than just coins, Brooks. Maybe you found a letter. Maybe something else Boone left behind." Before Thomas could even think of an answer, the distant clop of hooves cut through the tense silence. A single horse was approaching. Fast. The men froze, trading nervous looks. Whoever was coming rode with a measured confidence. This was not some drunk ranch hand or a passing traveler. Fletcher cursed softly under his breath. "The boss." Thomas's stomach knotted. There was someone above Fletcher Knox, someone pulling all the strings. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until a lone rider emerged from the darkness. The figure dismounted about 20 feet away, staying just beyond the reach of the lantern light, a silhouette in a long coat. The coat was tailored, expensive, more suited to a judge's chambers than a dusty ranch yard, and his voice, when it came, was refined, educated, far removed from the rough frontier drawl of Fletcher's gang. "Had to move the schedule up," the rider said, his voice cutting through the night. "Federal marshals are sniffing around the border. It's too risky to wait until tomorrow." Thomas held his breath. This was no mere smuggler. This was someone with real money, real power, and real protection. Fletcher stepped forward, his whole demeanor changing. He was suddenly deferential, almost fearful. "We've had complications," he said. "Another man found the well." The rider's head tilted toward Thomas, his face still hidden in the shadow. "Handle it," he said simply. "The same way you handled Boone and Delaney. Quickly. Quietly. We can't afford any loose ends." Caleb grinned, his teeth flashing in the lantern light like a wolf's. Reuben's knuckles whitened on the stock of his rifle. Fletcher, however, hesitated for a split second. "He mentioned the church foundation," he said, his voice careful. Even in the dark, Thomas could sense the shift in the air. The rider stiffened. His voice lost its smooth, educated veneer. Now it was edged with pure steel. "That's impossible. Only 3 men know of that site, and 2 of them are standing right here with you." The weight of those words pressed down on Thomas like a physical stone. He had stumbled into something vast, something far larger than just smuggling, larger than simple greed. Whatever lay hidden at that church foundation wasn't just evidence. It was a secret guarded by men powerful enough to make entire families vanish from the face of the earth. The rider's verdict came swift and merciless. "Dispose of him. Make it look like an accident. The well has claimed men before. Let it claim one more." Thomas's blood ran cold. They were going to stage it as a fall, just like Boone, just like Delaney. A slip into the darkness, a missing settler, nothing more than another whispered rumor for the town to chew on. Fletcher nodded, his jaw tight. Understood. The rider remounted his horse, his tone dismissive now. And Knox, this is the last time. If there are any more complications, I will find someone else to manage this corner of the operation. Burn the entire ranch to the ground if you have to, but there will be no more messes. With that, he turned and rode off back into the night, the sound of his horse's hooves fading like a death knell. Inside the cabin, Reuben shoved Thomas hard toward the table. The coins he'd gathered jingled in his pockets, betraying him with every single step. Caleb kicked the back of his legs, forcing him down into a chair. Fletcher followed slowly, studying Thomas as though he were trying to decide whether to kill him now or to savor the process. "The boss says you disappear," he said, his voice almost conversational. "But me? I like to understand a man first. It's like peeling the bark off a tree. You learn what's really underneath." He nodded at Caleb. "Lock him in the bedroom. We'll start asking our questions once the house is quiet." Thomas was dragged across the room, the old floorboards creaking under his boots. Caleb shoved him hard into what had once been Sterling Boone's bedroom. It was a space frozen in time. The bed was still made. The boots still sat beside it. A shirt hung limp on a peg on the wall. A life interrupted. Ready to resume, except its owner had never returned. Soon, if Knox's gang had their way, Thomas's few belongings would remain just like this too, untouched relics of another man who was simply erased. The door slammed shut, the iron latch clicked into place. In the sudden suffocating silence, Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He had no illusions. By dawn, he would either be dead at the bottom of that well, or broken and discarded somewhere out in the desert. But he also knew something they didn't. Sterling's letter, hidden deep in the lining of his jacket, pointed the way. The church foundation. That knowledge was his one and only weapon. If he could just survive the night, if he could somehow slip free, he still had a chance to uncover the truth and bring a cleansing light to whatever corruption had cursed this land for decades. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the wall, whispering to himself, "Hold on." The same words he had once spoken to his horse, the only anchor he had left in the world. But now they were his own lifeline. Thomas sat in the dim, dust-choked bedroom where Caleb had shoved him, his pulse still pounding from the rider's cold decree. The house smelled of abandonment and decay. Sterling Boone's shirt hung on a peg, his boots rested by the bed. His coffee cup sat with a dried ring at the bottom. It all felt like props on a stage, a set designed to trap the next victim. And that victim was him. The men outside were talking in low tones, their boots creaking on the porch boards. Through a crack in the warped door, Thomas could see the faint orange flicker of a lantern drifting past. He forced his breathing to steady. He had to think like a rancher again, not like a cornered animal. Panic would kill him faster than their rifles. The room itself offered little hope. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a simple chest of drawers, a window that had been nailed shut years ago. Then his eyes settled on the floorboards. Near the back wall, a small section looked different. The wood was newer, less weathered, paler than the rest. Sterling Boone had left warnings in the well. Maybe, just maybe, he had left something here, too. Thomas crouched, running his calloused fingers along the seams. One of the boards shifted slightly under the pressure. It wasn't nailed down. It was just laid into place. His heart leapt. The muffled voices outside grew louder. Fletcher was giving orders. He had minutes, at most. He wedged his fingertips beneath the edge of the loose plank and pried it up. A small cloud of dust puffed up around him. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity. And inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a small leather satchel. Next to it lay a short, heavy iron crowbar, Sterling's emergency kit. A wave of relief surged through Thomas's chest, followed quickly by a spike of dread. Boone had likely hidden these things for the exact same reason Thomas needed them now, to escape. He pulled the satchel free, shoving it quickly beneath his coat. Then he gripped the crowbar, its weight solid and cold and real in his hand. Voices rose in the other room. Boots shuffled. Caleb was shifting his position. Any second now, one of them might decide to check on him. Thomas's gaze shot to the window. The glass was thick with grime and dust, but it was unbarred. It was his only chance. He took one deep breath, raised the crowbar high, and slammed it against the window pane. The explosion of shattering glass filled the small house like a gunshot. Shards burst outward into the night, raining down over the porch roof. "What was that?" Caleb's voice barked, followed by the scrape of a rifle being lifted. Thomas didn't wait. He threw his shoulder through the jagged frame, ignoring the sharp sting as glass tore at his coat and his skin. He hit the dirt outside hard, rolled, and came up running. The satchel thumped against his ribs with every jarring stride. Shouts erupted behind him. Fletcher roaring orders, boots pounding against the wooden porch, the sharp metallic snap of a rifle being loaded. "Stop him!" Gunfire cracked the night open. Bullets whined past his head, kicking up little geysers of dust at his feet. Thomas ducked low, sprinting across the open yard toward the corral where his mare, Patience, still waited, tied to a post. The moonlit desert stretched out beyond, a pale sea of dust and sage. North. That was where Sterling's letter had pointed. The church foundation. He had to reach it. He had to reach it alive. Patience snorted and danced as he neared, sensing the danger in the air. Thomas vaulted the fence, ignoring the fire burning in his lungs. He tore at the reins, his fingers fumbling, his heart hammering in his ears. Another shot ripped through the air, so close he felt the wind of it graze his shoulder. "Find him! He can't get far!" Fletcher's voice bellowed through the darkness. Finally, the knot gave way. Thomas swung himself into the saddle, driving his heels hard into Patience's flanks. The mare lunged forward, bursting from the corral in a spray of dry dirt. Gunfire erupted again, chasing them out into the night. One bullet hissed past his ear. Another sparked off a stone near the trail. And then they were clear. The ranch shrank behind him, swallowed up by the vast desert shadows. But he could still hear the faint clatter of hoofbeats as pursuit began. Fletcher's men would saddle up fast, and they knew this land far better than he did. His only advantage was the head start, and the North Star, shining like a single sharp nail in the black heavens, guiding him onward. The desert stretched out before him, vast and ghostly under the moonlight. Strange rock formations loomed like petrified giants. Sagebrush cast long, dark shadows that twitched and twisted like grasping hands. The cool night air whipped at his face, stinging the cuts where the glass had sliced him, but the pain anchored him to the moment. He was alive. He was moving. He was free. For now. He risked a quick glance back over his shoulder. The ranch was no more than a tiny smudge of lamplight in the immense distance, but he could see faint shapes moving against it. 3 horsemen, mounting up, preparing to give chase. His chest tightened. There would be no rest tonight, no safe place to stop and catch his breath. Every single mile between him and those church ruins was a gauntlet, but Thomas clenched his jaw, leaning low over Patience's neck. "Hold steady, girl," he whispered, his voice ragged and torn. "North, just north." The mare obeyed, her stride long and steady, her powerful muscles rippling beneath him. The satchel pressed hard against his ribs. Inside it, Sterling Boone's legacy waited. Whatever secrets the smuggling ring had killed for, whatever evidence lay hidden in that old church foundation. Behind him the shouts grew fainter, finally swallowed by the endless desert. Ahead, the land opened into rolling dunes of pale dust, the moon casting everything in a stark silver light. Thomas Brooks was no longer just a poor farmer chasing a rumor of water. He was a man being hunted, carrying the truth in his coat and a burning determination in his chest. Each hoofbeat carried him farther from certain death and closer to a dangerous revelation. The night was still young, the desert was vast, and the story of the well was far, far from over. The moon guided Thomas northward until the landscape finally gave way to ruins. The jagged, skeletal remains of an old church crouched low in a shallow, windswept valley. Its walls were little more than stone ribs, half buried in sand and dust. Yet even in its collapse it radiated a solemn weight, the echo of forgotten prayers. He dismounted, his mare, Patience, blowing hard. He pulled Sterling Boone's heavy crowbar from the satchel. Somewhere in these crumbling walls lay the secret that Boone had died for. He ran his hands across the cold stone, searching. Hundreds of rocks pressed into his palms, all of them rough and weather-beaten. But only one bore the mark he needed. At last, on the northern wall, his fingers traced a carving that was unmistakable. A deep, rough X gouged into the stone about 3 feet above the ground. His pulse quickened. With a grunt, he wedged the tip of the crowbar into a crack beside the stone. He threw all his weight into it. The stone shifted, then gave way, grinding as it slid outward to reveal a dark, hollow cavity behind it. From the darkness he dragged out a heavy iron box. Its surface was pitted with rust, but it was still solid. The sheer weight of it alone told him that it held more than just coins. He dropped to his knees, pried the lid open, and the moonlight fell across stacks of yellowed papers. Not treasure, something sharper, something more dangerous. Ledgers, letters, contracts, and names. He lifted a ledger and saw the neatly inked record of transactions, shipments across the border, crates marked as farm equipment that were really stolen government rifles, receipts for contraband delivered under the cover of night. Each line item was signed, initialed, corroborated. Deeper in the box lay letters. Correspondence between men of immense power, a territorial judge approving payments for those stolen rifles, customs agents noting the bribes they'd received for shipments they'd waved through without inspection, local officials swearing their silence in exchange for a share of the profits. Sterling Boone hadn't been chasing wealth. He'd been compiling evidence. Evidence of a massive conspiracy that reached deep into the very marrow of the territory's institutions. Thomas's breath fogged in the chill night air as the full realization set in. This was never just about a cursed ranch or some strange coins. It was about a smuggling empire, hidden in plain sight, shielded by the very men who were sworn to enforce the law. The coins had been bait, yes, but the real hoard was this proof. Hoofbeats clattered from the ridge above the valley. He spun around, clutching the ledger. 3 riders crested the ridge, the light from their lantern throwing them into stark, menacing relief. Fletcher Knox led them, his black coat flaring like a crow's wing, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Reuben and Caleb flanked him, their rifles raised and ready. "That's far enough, Brooks," Knox called out, his voice a whip crack against the ancient stone. "Hand over the box." Thomas rose slowly, the iron chest at his feet, but instead of reaching for it, he lifted one of the letters high so the moonlight illuminated the signature at the bottom. "I know what you're running here, Knox," he shouted, his voice echoing off the ruins. "I know who you're protecting. Judge Morrison's name is right here, signing off on payments for stolen rifles. Customs Agent Williams, paid to look the other way. You're not just smugglers. You're a conspiracy, rotting this entire territory from the top down." Knox's sneer faltered for a second, his eyes narrowing. In his saddle, Reuben shifted uneasily. Caleb's knuckles whitened around the stock of his rifle. For the very first time, Thomas saw a flicker of doubt in their hard faces. These papers, they carried a power more lethal than any bullet. "You think those scraps of paper mean anything?" Knox growled, forcing the bravado back into his tone. "Dead men don't testify." "Maybe," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear that was tightening its icy grip around his chest. "But I'm not the only one who knows. Others already have copies." It was a bluff, a desperate last-ditch lie, but he delivered it like it was gospel truth. And there, under the silent witness of the ruined church, with the damning evidence clutched in his scarred hands, Thomas knew he had finally shifted the balance. The coins had lured him into this trap, but now, with this box, the trap had finally snapped shut on the very men who had laid it. Thomas stood firm among the broken stones of the old church, the heavy iron box of documents at his feet, and that single damning letter raised high in his hand. Knox's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, their rifles gleaming under the moon. But Thomas's voice cut through the cold night air with a conviction they could not ignore. "You think you can just bury this?" he said, holding the papers aloft like a shield. "Before I ever came out here, I made copies of Sterling Boone's original letter. I sent them to 3 different newspapers, across 3 different territories. If I don't return by morning, every editor will know exactly where to start digging, and the names in these ledgers will be making headlines from here to the Capitol." He let the threat hang in the air. "Judge Morrison, Agent Williams, and all the rest of your powerful friends in high places." The names landed like hammer blows. Knox's sneer finally faltered, and the false bravado in his men began to visibly crumble. They could picture it. Federal investigators tearing through the territory's corruption. The names of their powerful, untouchable allies, printed in bold black ink for the entire country to see. A single bullet might silence Thomas Brooks, but it wouldn't silence the scandal that his bluff promised to ignite. Reuben gritted his teeth, muttering under his breath, "Let's just finish him now, Fletcher." But Knox raised a hand sharply, his cold eyes locked on Thomas. The outlaw leader wasn't stupid. He understood the stakes. Killing this man might bury a body, but if those letters to the newspapers truly existed, it would also ignite a firestorm powerful enough to consume every single one of them. The silence stretched out, broken only by the restless snort of the horses and the faint, almost imperceptible rattle of the cursed coins still in Thomas's pocket. Knox weighed his options, his mind racing. He had spent years building this smuggling ring, carefully cultivating his allies in government and law. But one wrong move here, tonight, could unravel everything he had ever built. Finally, with a low hiss of pure frustration, he holstered his pistol. "Mount up," he barked at his men. "We're done here." Reuben and Caleb stared at him in disbelief, but Knox's furious glare silenced them both. "He's already poisoned the well," Knox growled. "If those newspapers already know, this whole operation is finished." The 3 men wheeled their horses, their dark figures retreating back over the ridge and toward the horizon. Dust rose in their wake, carried away by the lonely desert wind, leaving Thomas standing all alone among the ruins. His chest heaved with adrenaline, but he did not lower the papers until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast, empty silence. He had bluffed his way out of his own grave, and for the first time the conspiracy had broken ranks and run. The evidence was still in his hands, every name, every ledger, every dirty little secret. The smuggling ring was fractured, and Thomas now held the power to bring it all crashing down. 3 months later, the story that had begun at a dry, forgotten well reached its thunderous conclusion inside a federal courthouse. Thomas stood in the gallery, watching as Judge Morrison, the very same man whose name had appeared in Sterling Boone's hidden ledgers, was led away in shackles. The proud, untouchable figure was now bowed under the weight of his own corruption, his black judge's robe traded for simple prison gray. The trial had exposed everything. The documents, the ledgers, and the letters that Thomas had carried out of that church foundation laid the entire conspiracy bare. With each piece of evidence, the tangled web of smuggling, bribery, and murder unraveled. 12 arrests followed in swift succession. Territorial officials, customs agents, even men who had once claimed to uphold the law. The conspiracy that had stolen lives and silenced voices for decades was finally gone, dismantled not by armies or guns, but by the simple, undeniable truth, carved into paper and carried to safety by one determined man. For Thomas, it was more than just justice. It was vindication. It was the first true reward for his long, dangerous fight. When the dust of the trials finally settled, Thomas stood not as a fugitive or a drifter, but as a man restored. The federal government rewarded him for exposing the smuggling ring and for preserving the evidence that had toppled so many powerful men. Along with that recognition came the legal, uncontested deed to the ranch. The once haunted land was now his by right, not by rumor. For the first time in years, he owned something free and clear, with no debt and no deception tied to it. But the victory was not his alone. The families of Sterling Boone and Samuel Delaney, men who were once whispered about as deserters or madmen, were publicly cleared of all shame. Their names were spoken in that court with honor. Their loved ones were granted compensation from the treasury. Where once there had been suspicion and silence, now there was vindication. A true record that would outlive any rumor. And Thomas himself found a new kind of wealth. One evening he walked again to the old well at the center of his new ranch. The bucket still drew up cold, clear water. But the glittering, cursed coins were gone, turned over as evidence, catalogued and locked away in a government vault. Staring down into that circle of stones, he understood that he had received something far greater than gold. Not a treasure that could corrode or tempt, but justice earned, and a future that was finally his own. The well no longer whispered of danger. It stood as a silent marker of survival, a place where despair had been traded for hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of mystery and justice from the Old West.